Did society fail Agustina Fernández twice? First by not seeing the warning signs, and then by taking 6 months to uncover the truth that was hiding in plain sight? No is no. These were the powerful last words Agustina's mother delivered to Pablo Parra in court. But why did this 19-year-old medical student have to pay with her life to deliver this message? In a case that shook Argentina to its core, the murder of Agustina exposed a disturbing pattern that began with seemingly innocent gestures. A spare key, a washing machine, friendly dinners, and ended in a carefully orchestrated killing that its perpetrator tried to disguise as a random robbery. But what makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of the crime. It's how the murderer continued his normal life afterward, attending electronic music festivals and giving media interviews while Agustina's family searched for justice. The discovery of a small piece of blue cloth caught on a fence would eventually unravel an elaborate web of lies. But it raises a haunting question. How many other Agustinas are out there right now, trying to navigate the dangerous waters between politeness and self-preservation? This isn't just a story about a murder. It's a mirror held up to society's face, forcing us to confront the deadly price women sometimes pay for simply saying no. In the sun-drenched city of Santa Rosa, La Pampa, a young woman's dream was taking flight. It was early 2022, and 19-year-old Agustina Fernández stood at the threshold of everything she had ever wanted. With her warm smile and determined spirit, she had already mapped out the path to her future. She would become a cardiologist, saving lives one heartbeat at a time. Those who knew Agustina remember a girl who carried sunshine in her wake. Her former teacher, Juan, recalls a student whose passion for medicine lit up every classroom she entered. She wasn't just bright, he says, his voice soft with memory. She had this creative spark, this incredible drive to understand everything about the human body. When she talked about becoming a doctor, her eyes would light up with such purpose. In the Fernández household, Agustina was more than just the eldest daughter. She was a beacon of possibility. Her mother Silvana and father Mariano had always encouraged their children to chase their dreams, no matter how far they might lead. For Agustina, that dream would take her 600 kilometers away to Cipolletti, Rio Negro, where the National University of Comahue held the key to her future in medicine. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Like many students of her generation, Agustina had spent her first year of university learning through a computer screen, navigating the challenges of virtual education during the pandemic. But 2022 brought new hope. Classes would finally be in person, and Agustina could immerse herself in the full university experience she had longed for. She was nervous about moving away, Silvana remembers, her eyes misting as she speaks of those last days at home. But she was so excited too. She had her little sister helping her pack, making lists of everything she'd need for her new life. The bond between the sisters was unbreakable, filled with shared secrets and dreams whispered late into the night. In March 2022, the Fernández family made the long drive to Cipolletti, their car packed with boxes full of Agustina's belongings and hopes. They had found her a small apartment in a quiet complex on Confluencia Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and safe, or so they thought. It would be close enough to the university for easy commuting. A perfect starter home for a young student beginning her independent life. Agustina took to her new surroundings with characteristic enthusiasm. She decorated her small space with photos of her family, medical textbooks lined up neatly on makeshift shelves. Her mother helped her arrange everything just so, both of them imagining the countless hours of study that would take place at the small desk by the window. She was so grateful, Silvana recalls, her voice catching. She kept thanking us for supporting her, for helping her make this happen. She promised she would make us proud. A promise Agustina had already fulfilled simply by being who she was, a dedicated student, a loving daughter, a caring sister, and a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The first few weeks in Cipolletti were filled with the typical adjustments of any university student living alone for the first time. Agustina learned to budget her money, cook simple meals, and navigate the rhythm of her new city. She made friends quickly, her natural warmth drawing people to her. She would video call her family regularly, sharing stories about her classes, her new friends, and her growing excitement about her future in medicine. None of them could have known that this bright beginning would lead to such darkness. That the same apartment complex that represented Agustina's independence would become the scene of unimaginable tragedy. That among the new faces she encountered in those early days was one that would ultimately bring an end to all her dreams. In just 3 short months, the story of Agustina Fernández would transform from a tale of youthful ambition and promise into one of Argentina's most haunting cases of femicide. But to understand how such promise could be so brutally extinguished, we must first look at the seemingly innocent beginnings of a chance encounter that would set in motion a chain of events leading to that fatal July night. The future that stretched before Agustina in those early spring days seemed limitless. She was 19, beautiful, intelligent, and determined. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a dreamer. She was everything a young woman should be allowed to be, and she had no way of knowing that her time was running out. The first time Agustina Fernández saw Pablo Parra, he was washing his car in the apartment complex's parking lot. It was a seemingly mundane moment on a March afternoon in 2022, as the 37-year-old oil company technician methodically cleaned his vehicle while Agustina and her parents toured what would become her new home. He appeared friendly enough, offering a neighborly wave as the family passed by, a gesture that would later take on a much darker significance. He seemed nice, Silvana Capello, Agustina's mother, would later recall, her voice tight with regret. Just a normal neighbor going about his day. How could we have known? That first encounter, so casual and unremarkable, would prove to be the beginning of an obsession that would end in tragedy. Pablo Parra cut an unassuming figure in the community. A technical safety specialist at a local oil and gas company, he lived alone in the ground floor apartment of the complex. To his colleagues, he was professional and competent, someone who understood emergency protocols and safety procedures. To his neighbors, he was polite but kept mostly to himself. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay something far more sinister. The 18-year age gap between Parra and Agustina should have been the first red flag. Even before she officially moved in, he had already begun inserting himself into her life. When he learned she would be relocating from Santa Rosa, he offered to pick her up from the airport, a gesture that made Silvana uncomfortable enough to insist her daughter decline. What kind of grown man offers to pick up a teenage girl he's never met? Silvana would later ask investigators, the pain evident in her voice. Now I know it was the first sign of his fixation on her. Once Agustina moved in, Parra's presence in her life grew steadily more pronounced. He positioned himself as the helpful neighbor, always available to assist the young student still finding her footing in a new city. He offered the use of his washing machine when Agustina didn't have one of her own. He gave her a copy of his apartment key, ostensibly to make it easier for her to do laundry. Each gesture, seemingly kind on the surface, was another thread in the web he was carefully weaving. To the other residents of the complex, Parra's behavior began to take on an unsettling pattern. Diana Morales, a neighbor who lived across the hall, remembered an interaction that would later haunt her. He was talking about Agustina one day, she testified, and he said, "Did you see that little treat I'm eating?" The way he said it made my skin crawl. He spoke about her like she was a thing, not a person. What the neighbors couldn't see were the mounting signs of Parra's growing obsession. Despite their casual relationship, he had already begun planning a future that existed only in his mind. He purchased an engagement ring. He made reservations for trips to San Martin de los Andes. He was crafting an entire life story with a young woman who had never agreed to be part of it. Former partners of Parra would later come forward with disturbing accounts of his controlling behavior. One ex-girlfriend described how he would monitor her social media, show up uninvited at her workplace, and send messages under false identities to test her loyalty. These patterns of obsessive behavior had been present long before Agustina entered his life. But now they had found a new focus in a 19-year-old student who was just beginning to spread her wings. The most chilling aspect of Parra's fixation was how he used his position as a neighbor to maintain constant surveillance of Agustina's life. From his ground floor apartment, he could monitor her comings and goings. He knew when she had visitors, when she was alone, when she was vulnerable. His apartment became an observation post from which he could track every detail of her daily routine. As winter approached in Cipolletti, the temperature wasn't the only thing growing colder. Para's obsession was intensifying, feeding on every small interaction, every casual encounter. When Agustina began to distance herself, showing interest in others her own age, the rejection only fueled his fixation. The helpful neighbor was transforming into something far more dangerous, and time was running out for someone to notice. Looking back now, one resident of the complex would later say, "We all saw pieces of the puzzle, but nobody put them together until it was too late." The friendly neighbor who had once seemed so harmless was revealing himself to be something else entirely. A predator hiding in plain sight, waiting for his moment to strike. In the coming months, the true nature of Pablo Para would be revealed in the most tragic way possible. But in those early days of autumn 2022, he was still just the neighbor next door, a man whose ordinary appearance masked extraordinary dangers, whose seemingly helpful gestures concealed sinister intentions, and whose obsession would ultimately lead to an act of violence that would shock an entire nation. The relationship between Agustina Fernández and Pablo Para began like many modern connections, casual, undefined, and seemingly uncomplicated. But beneath the surface, a deadly pattern was emerging, one that would reveal the darkest aspects of obsession and control. By April 2022, Agustina had settled into her new life in Cipolletti. Like many 19-year-olds living away from home for the first time, she was exploring her independence, making new friends, and navigating the complexities of adult relationships. What started as neighborly interactions with Para gradually evolved into something more intimate, though for Agustina, it was never meant to be serious. She was very clear about what she wanted, explains Julian, one of Agustina's closest friends at university. She would talk about her neighbor. She never used his name, always just called him the neighbor. And she would tell me how he was becoming too intense, too demanding. Julian's testimony would later become crucial in understanding the progression of events that led to tragedy. The first signs of Para's possessiveness emerged subtly. He began appearing whenever Agustina had visitors, finding reasons to be in the hallway or the courtyard. He would send messages throughout the day, expecting immediate responses. What might have seemed like attention and care to some was, in reality, the beginning of surveillance. Then came the gifts. Not small tokens, but grand gestures that spoke of future plans Agustina had never agreed to. The engagement ring appeared one day, presented without warning or consent. She was shocked, recalls another friend who wishes to remain anonymous. Who gives an engagement ring to someone they're not even dating? She was only 19, still figuring out who she was, and here was this man twice her age planning their future without her permission. The trip to San Martín de los Andes was perhaps the most alarming gesture. Para had planned it all: accommodations, activities, their life together, without consulting Agustina. When she declined, expressing her discomfort with the situation, his behavior began to shift. The rejected gifts became weapons, emotional leverage he would try to use to guilt her into spending more time with him. By June, Agustina was actively trying to distance herself from Para. She had met other people, including Nathaniel, a young man her age who worked at a local bar. Their connection was natural, uncomplicated, everything her interaction with Para was not. But creating this distance proved more difficult than she anticipated. The apartment complex became like a cage, explains Diana Morales, another neighbor. He was always there, watching. If Agustina had friends over, he would find reasons to knock on her door. If she came home late, he would be in the courtyard, pretending to smoke or check his car. It was suffocating. Text messages recovered from Agustina's phone reveal her growing discomfort. In messages to friends, she expressed anxiety about Para's behavior. "He's always there," one message read. "I can't even go to the laundry room without him appearing. I don't know how to make him understand that I don't want what he wants." The pattern was familiar to those who study cases of femicide. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a specialist in gender violence, explains, "What we see here is a classic escalation. The perpetrator begins with what appears to be kindness and attention, then progresses to gifts that create a sense of obligation. When these tactics fail to secure the desired control, the behavior often turns to intimidation and, ultimately, violence. Para's ex-partner would later testify about similar patterns in their relationship. "He would create these elaborate fantasies about our future together," she stated. "When reality didn't match his expectations, he became different, darker. He couldn't accept that my choices might not align with his plans." As June turned to July, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Agustina had begun to confide in her mother about her concerns, though she downplayed the severity of the situation. "She didn't want us to worry," Silvana would later recall, her voice breaking. "She thought she could handle it. She was always so strong, so independent. How could she know that her strength would make him more determined?" The dynamic between them had become a powder keg. Para's obsession had grown alongside Agustina's increasing attempts to establish boundaries. Every time she pulled away, his grip tightened. Every assertion of her independence was met with escalating attempts to control her movements, her relationships, her life. In the first days of July 2022, Agustina was making plans for her future, plans that didn't include Pablo Para. She was excelling in her studies, forming new relationships, living the life of a normal 19-year-old university student. But in the ground floor apartment below her, a man's obsession was reaching its deadly climax, and time was running out. The pattern that had been building for months was about to reach its tragic conclusion. All the warning signs were there: the possessiveness, the surveillance, the inability to accept rejection. But like so many cases before it, these red flags would only become clearly visible in the harsh light of hindsight, after it was too late to save a young woman whose only crime was daring to live life on her own terms. July 2nd dawned like any other winter Saturday in Cipolletti. The morning air was crisp, and the sun cast long shadows across the apartment complex on Confluencia Street. For Agustina Fernández, it would be a day like many others, until it wasn't. No one could have known that by nightfall, the events of this day would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The day began normally enough. Agustina had made plans to meet Natanel, the young bartender she'd been seeing. Around 3 p.m., he arrived at her apartment. Their relationship was everything. Her interaction with Pablo Para wasn't natural, uncomplicated, filled with the kind of easy affection that comes with being young and finding someone who shares your wavelength. "We just wanted to spend time together," Natanel would later testify, his voice heavy with emotion. "We played music, talked about everything and nothing. It was just a normal afternoon." The couple shared mate, an herbal drink common in Argentina, and enjoyed each other's company. The window was open, letting in the winter breeze, a detail that would later prove significant. From his ground floor apartment, Pablo Para could hear everything: the laughter, the music, the intimate sounds of a young couple enjoying each other's company. Each sound was like a dagger, feeding his growing rage. During this time, he sent Agustina a message that would go unanswered, a digital timestamp marking the beginning of the end. Around 6 p.m., Natanel had to leave for his shift at the bar. "She asked me to stay the night after my shift," he would later recall, tears in his eyes. "I promised I'd come back around 3 or 4 in the morning. If only I had stayed. If only I had known." His voice trails off, carrying the weight of what-ifs that would haunt him forever. Soon after Natanel's departure, Para put his plan into motion. He invited Agustina to have dinner at his apartment. It seemed innocent enough. They were neighbors, after all, and had shared meals before. Agustina accepted, perhaps hoping to maintain a cordial relationship with her neighbor, perhaps not wanting to escalate tensions by refusing. He told her he needed to run some errands first. Prosecutor Martin Petzetta would later explain. He said he needed to buy some things for dinner. It was all part of his calculated plan. At approximately 7:30 p.m., security cameras captured Para leaving the apartment complex. He made sure he was seen, carefully constructing his alibi. He visited his father's house, bought ice cream, purchased beer, normal activities that would later be used to support his story. But what the cameras didn't capture was his return, not through the front entrance, but through a more sinister route. Investigators would later reconstruct these crucial moments. While Agustina waited in his apartment, Parra circled back, using a ladder to scale the back wall of the complex. He navigated through the barbed wire fence, leaving behind a crucial piece of evidence, a scrap of blue fabric with his DNA. This was no crime of passion. It was premeditated, calculated, deadly. Two neighbors, Diana Morales and Ricardo Espinoza, would later testify about what they heard around this time. There were screams, Diana recalled, her voice shaking, a woman's voice shouting, "Stop! Stop!" Then silence. The kind of silence that makes your blood run cold. The timeline constructed by investigators reveals the horrifying precision of Parra's actions. He had created the perfect trap, luring Agustina to his apartment under the guise of friendship, ensuring witnesses saw him leave, then returning secretly to carry out his brutal attack. It was a plan born of obsession, rejection, and a deadly sense of entitlement. By the time Parra officially returned to his apartment, ice cream and beer in hand, Agustina lay brutally beaten on his floor. He then initiated the next phase of his plan, staging a robbery and playing the role of the concerned neighbor who had discovered the crime. At 8:45 p.m., Silvana Capello received the call that would shatter her world. It was Parra using a neighbor's phone, his voice carefully controlled as he explained that there had been a robbery, that Agustina was hurt, that he had just found her like this when he returned home. The sun had set on Cipolletti, but the darkness that had descended on Confluencia Street would prove far deeper than the night itself. July 2nd, 2022, had begun as an ordinary Saturday. It ended as the day that would forever be marked as the beginning of a nightmare, a day when young love and obsession collided with devastating consequences. A day when dreams were shattered by the sound of screams that no one could unhear. In the annals of criminal investigation, it's often said that there's no such thing as a perfect crime. But Pablo Parra had spent weeks, perhaps months, crafting what he believed was an unassailable plan. The prosecution would later reveal how each element was meticulously orchestrated, showing the chilling calculation behind what was initially portrayed as a robbery gone wrong. The attack itself was brutal in its execution. After secretly re-entering his apartment through the back entrance, Parra confronted Agustina. The forensic evidence would later tell the story that Parra tried so hard to hide. Dr. Maria Santos, the lead forensic investigator, explains, the first blow caught her by surprise. When she tried to escape, he slammed the door on her hand, breaking multiple fingers. This wasn't random violence. It was methodical, controlled. As Agustina fought for her life, her attempts to defend herself left crucial evidence under her fingernails. DNA that would later become a point of contention in the investigation. The attack continued with increasing violence, focused primarily on her head. The pattern of injuries, Dr. Santos continues, suggests someone who wanted to silence her, to stop her from crying out, from being heard. After the attack, Parra's movements were precise and practiced. He changed his clothes, carefully concealing the ones he had worn during the assault. He scattered items around his apartment, creating the appearance of a rushed robbery. Then came the most calculated part of his plan, establishing his alibi. He didn't just create an alibi, explains Detective Roberto Vega. He created a performance. Security cameras captured Parra at various locations. His father's house, an ice cream shop, a local store buying beer. Each stop was deliberately chosen, each transaction carefully timed. He made sure to use his debit card, leaving an electronic trail of his movements. The staging of the crime scene was equally meticulous. Parra removed certain items, Agustina's phone, a bag of clothes, his own cell phone, while leaving others of greater value untouched. 2 brand new phones and a wallet containing money were left in plain sight, Detective Vega notes. What kind of thief takes clothes but leaves cash? When Parra finally discovered Agustina, his response was carefully calibrated. He went to a neighbor's apartment, borrowed their phone, and made 3 calls, to emergency services, to the police, and to Agustina's mother. Each call painted him as the concerned neighbor, the innocent bystander who had stumbled upon a tragedy. His demeanor during the calls was telling, says emergency operator Elena Ruiz, who took the first call. Most people who discover a violent crime scene are panicked, emotional. He was composed, almost methodical in his description of events. What Parra couldn't have planned for were the small details that would later unravel his carefully constructed narrative. The piece of blue fabric caught on the barbed wire, bearing his DNA. The testimonies of neighbors who heard screams precisely when he claimed to be away. The surveillance footage that showed inconsistencies in his timeline. Perhaps most damning was his behavior in the immediate aftermath. Rocio, his former safety instructor, would later testify that Parra had extensive training in emergency response. He knew CPR, he knew basic first aid, she stated. Yet when he found Agustina, he did nothing to help her. He didn't even check her vital signs. Instead of attempting to save her life, Parra focused on establishing his narrative. He repeated his story of the robbery to anyone who would listen, never varying in the details, as if reciting from a script. While Agustina lay fighting for her life, he was already building his defense. In the hours that followed, while Agustina was rushed to the hospital, Parra continued his performance. He appeared at the hospital with his parents, offering support to Agustina's family even as he knew he was responsible for their pain. It was beyond calculated, says prosecutor Martín Petzetta. It was cruel. The plan might have worked if not for one crucial miscalculation. Parra underestimated the determination of investigators, the observant nature of his neighbors, and most importantly, the fierce love of a mother who would not rest until she uncovered the truth about what happened to her daughter. As Agustina lay in the hospital, her life slipping away, the perfect plan began to show its first cracks. The staged robbery scene, the calculated alibi, the careful performance, all would eventually crumble under the weight of evidence and truth. But for 3 agonizing days, while Agustina fought for her life, Pablo Parra walked free, believing he had executed the perfect crime. The reality would prove different. As investigators would discover, there is no such thing as a perfect plan when it comes to murder. Every action leaves a trace, every calculation leaves a clue, and every attempt to cover up the truth only leads to more questions. In the end, Parra's meticulous planning would become the very evidence that would condemn him. The moment Silvana Capello received that phone call at 8:45 p.m. on July 2nd, something deep within her knew this was no ordinary robbery. The controlled voice of Pablo Parra on the other end of the line, explaining how he had discovered her daughter, sent chills down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter night. His voice was too calm, Silvana would later testify, her hands clasped tightly together. What kind of person finds a young girl beaten nearly to death and speaks with such composure? This was the first of many red flags that would haunt Silvana in the days to come. Racing to the hospital with her husband Mariano, Silvana's world shattered when she saw her daughter. I could barely recognize my baby, she recalls, her voice breaking. Only her nose. Just her nose was familiar to me. Everything else was so swollen, so damaged. The brutal reality of what had happened to Agustina was worse than anything they could have imagined. While doctors fought to save Agustina's life, the initial police investigation took a direction that would later prove catastrophically wrong. Rather than focusing on Pablo Parra, investigators were drawn to the story of a mysterious intruder. On July 8th, they released a sketch of their prime suspect, a young man in his 20s or early 30s, with distinctive facial tattoos and the word rock tattooed across his fingers. We were looking for a ghost, admits Detective Carlos Mendoza, who was among the first assigned to the case. We had this image of a tattooed criminal, while the real killer was right there, playing the role of the concerned neighbor. The release of the sketch and a reward of 1 million pesos for information marked a critical misstep in the investigation. While police resources were directed toward finding this non-existent suspect, Parra remained free, even attending vigils for Agustina and offering support to her family. But Silvana couldn't shake her suspicions. Why would my daughter fight so hard to protect someone else's belongings? She questioned. This wasn't her apartment. These weren't her things. It made no sense. Her maternal instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong with Parra's story. The initial evidence seemed to support the robbery theory. Both Agustina's and Parra's phones were missing. A bag of clothes was gone. Even a silver rosary had disappeared. Yet when investigators arrived at the scene, they found 2 brand new cell phones and a wallet containing money, untouched on Parra's table. The crime scene felt staged, recalls forensic investigator Laura Vasquez. Everything was too perfect, too deliberately messy. Real robberies have a different kind of chaos. But without concrete evidence linking Parra to the attack, investigators continued pursuing the tattooed suspect theory. As Agustina lay in critical condition, supported by machines, Silvana began her own quiet investigation. She spoke with neighbors, piecing together the dynamics between her daughter and Parra. The picture that emerged was disturbing. A pattern of obsession, control, and escalating behavior that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. Diana Morales, a neighbor, finally came forward with the chilling comment she had heard Parra make about Agustina being his little treat. Other residents began sharing stories of his constant presence, his watchful eyes, his way of appearing whenever Agustina had visitors. It was like a dam breaking, says prosecutor Martín Petzetta. Once people started talking, the truth began pouring out. But we needed more than suspicions. We needed evidence. That evidence would come, but not before Agustina lost her fight for life. On July 5th, after 3 days of desperate medical intervention, she was declared brain dead. The investigation shifted from assault to homicide, raising the stakes and intensifying the pressure to find her killer. Silvana's grief turned to determination. "I knew in my heart who had done this," she says. "A mother knows. But I needed the world to see it too." She began speaking out, questioning the focus on the tattooed suspect, demanding that investigators look more closely at the neighbor who had inserted himself so thoroughly into her daughter's life. The initial investigation's missteps would later be scrutinized. How had they so quickly accepted Parra's version of events? Why hadn't they questioned the inconsistencies in his story more thoroughly? The answers would reveal uncomfortable truths about how cases of violence against women are sometimes investigated, and how predators can hide behind respectability and careful planning. But Silvana's intuition would ultimately be vindicated. As she stood vigil by her daughter's hospital bed, as she planned a funeral no mother should have to plan, as she watched Pablo Parra attend community gatherings in support of her daughter, she never wavered in her conviction. The truth would eventually emerge, but the cost of that delayed recognition would be measured in the precious days when evidence could have been gathered, when witnesses might have spoken up sooner, when perhaps, or just perhaps, Agustina might have been saved. A mother's intuition isn't evidence, Silvana says now, her eyes filling with tears. But it led us to the evidence. I wish they had listened sooner. Truth has a way of emerging, piece by piece, like a puzzle slowly coming together. In the case of Agustina Fernández's murder, the critical breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a small piece of blue fabric caught on barbed wire behind the apartment complex. It seemed insignificant at first, recalls forensic investigator Marco Ruiz, holding up an evidence photograph of the fabric. Just a scrap of cloth torn on a fence. But in criminal investigations, the smallest details often tell the biggest stories. That piece of fabric would become the thread that would unravel Pablo Parra's carefully constructed alibi. The DNA analysis revealed not only Parra's genetic material on the fabric, but also showed fibers matching those found on Agustina's clothing. More importantly, this evidence placed Parra exactly where he claimed he had never been, scaling the back wall of the apartment complex on the night of the murder. Surveillance footage began to tell its own story. Cameras around the neighborhood had captured Parra's movements that evening, his visit to his father's house, the ice cream shop, the beer purchase. He wanted to be seen, explains Detective Laura Vasquez. Each stop was a deliberate performance, creating witnesses to his whereabouts. But there was a crucial gap in his timeline. This gap coincided perfectly with witness testimonies. Two neighbors, Diana Morales and Ricardo Espinoza, had heard a woman screams around 7:30 p.m., precisely during the period when Parra claimed to be running errands. Their statements, initially overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigation, now took on new significance. The screams were unmistakable, Ricardo testified. They weren't the kind of screams you hear from someone being robbed. They were desperate, pleading. Then there was this terrible silence. The timing of these screams aligned perfectly with the period when Parra had disappeared from security cameras. The physical evidence from the crime scene began to speak volumes. Dr. Elena Marquez, the forensic pathologist who examined Agustina's injuries, found patterns inconsistent with a random attack. The blows were targeted, precise, she explains. This wasn't the chaotic violence of a robbery gone wrong. This was controlled, sustained aggression from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Perhaps most damning was what investigators found in Parra's new apartment months later, the very items he had claimed were stolen during the supposed robbery. "We found Agustina's phone," says Detective Vasquez, along with other items he claimed the burglar had taken. He hadn't even bothered to dispose of them properly. It was as if he thought he was untouchable. Phone records revealed another crucial detail. 2 weeks after the murder, Parra had attempted to sell $400 to a coworker. This was significant, explains prosecutor Pizzetta, because he had claimed all his savings, approximately $1,000, had been stolen during the robbery. Where did this money come from if he had been robbed of everything? The evidence mounted in other ways. Security expert Rocio, who had trained Parra in emergency response procedures, provided crucial testimony about his capabilities. He knew exactly what to do in medical emergencies, she stated. Yet when he found Agustina, he did nothing to help her. His training should have kicked in automatically. Unless he already knew it was too late, digital forensics revealed a pattern of obsession in Parra's online behavior. His internet search history showed repeated visits to Agustina's social media profiles, searches for her name, and multiple attempts to track her activities online. It was classic stalking behavior, explains Dr. Ana Rivera, a forensic psychologist. He was monitoring her constantly, building an imaginary relationship that existed only in his mind. The DNA evidence under Agustina's fingernails, which initially didn't match Parra's, was later explained by Dr. Marquez. In cases of severe head trauma, defensive wounds aren't always present. The victim may be incapacitated before they have a chance to fight back. Each piece of evidence contributed to a devastating portrait of premeditation. The ladder used to scale the wall had been positioned days in advance. The timing of the dinner invitation was calculated to ensure Agustina would be alone. Even the staging of the robbery showed careful planning, certain items taken, others deliberately left behind to support his story. What we saw, concludes prosecutor Pizzetta, was not just a murder, but an elaborately staged production. Every detail, from the fake robbery to the careful construction of an alibi, showed planning and forethought. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution. As the evidence accumulated, Parra's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The helpful neighbor, the concerned friend, the innocent bystander, each role he had played was exposed as part of an elaborate deception. The truth that emerged was far more sinister. A predator who had planned, watched, and waited, turning an apartment complex into a hunting ground, and a young woman's dreams into a nightmare. In the end, it wasn't one piece of evidence that proved decisive, but the overwhelming accumulation of proof, physical, digital, and testimonial, that revealed the true face of Pablo Parra. The truth had been there all along, hidden behind a mask of normalcy, waiting to be uncovered by those determined enough to look for it. Behind every mask of normalcy can lie a monster, and Pablo Parra's facade began to crumble as those who knew him started to speak. In the months following Agustina's murder, a disturbing portrait emerged of a man whose ordinary appearance concealed years of predatory behavior and obsessive tendencies. He was like two different people, recalls Maria Torres, a former girlfriend who came forward after Agustina's death. Her voice trembles as she speaks. At first, he was charming, attentive, almost too attentive. But when things didn't go his way, there was this darkness that would come over him. Her testimony would reveal a pattern that had been repeating itself long before Agustina entered his life. Maria described incidents that now seem like clear warning signs. He would create fake social media accounts to monitor my activities. He once tried to break into my workplace after hours, claiming he was worried about me. When I confronted him, he always had an explanation that made me doubt my own judgment. Other women from Para's past began sharing similar stories. Each account followed a chilling pattern. Initial charm giving way to obsession, rejection leading to escalating behavior, and always the need for control. He couldn't handle any form of rejection, explains Dr. Ana Mendoza, a forensic psychologist who analyzed Para's behavior patterns. For him, rejection wasn't just emotional. It was an assault on his sense of self. The neighbors at the Confluencia Street complex, now free from fear, began sharing their observations. Diana Morales recounted the disturbing comment about Agustina being his little treat, but there was more. He would stand in the courtyard for hours, smoking cigarettes, always positioned where he could see her apartment. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at her window in the middle of the night. Particularly revealing was testimony from Para's co-workers at the oil company. Jose Ramirez, who had worked with him for 3 years, described an incident that took on new significance after Agustina's murder. About 2 weeks after it happened, he tried to sell me $400. He was nervous, pushing for the transaction to happen quickly. This was the same man who had claimed all his money was stolen in the supposed robbery. But perhaps most chilling was how Para had used his professional training to enhance his predatory behavior. As a safety technician, he understood emergency protocols and first aid. This knowledge made him more dangerous, explains Detective Vasquez. He knew exactly how much force to use, how to stage a crime scene, how to manipulate evidence. The investigation unveiled disturbing patterns in his daily routine. Security cameras revealed how he had methodically studied Agustina's schedule, timing his appearances to maximize contact with her. He knew when she left for classes, when she returned, when she did laundry, says Detective Vasquez. He created situations where their paths would accidentally cross. Even more disturbing was his behavior after the murder. While Agustina lay dying in the hospital, Para attended vigils, offered support to her family, and played the role of the concerned neighbor perfectly. It was like he was enjoying it, recalls one neighbor who wishes to remain anonymous. He would discuss theories about the real killer with anyone who would listen, always steering conversations away from himself. His performance extended to his interactions with law enforcement. During initial questioning, he was cooperative to the point of being eager, volunteering information and theories about the supposed burglar. It was almost too perfect, recalls Detective Mendoza. He had an answer for everything, but looking back, every answer seemed rehearsed. The facade began to show its first cracks during the extended investigation. When confronted with evidence that contradicted his story, Para's composed demeanor would briefly slip, revealing flashes of the rage that lay beneath. During one particularly intense interrogation, he slammed his fist on the table so hard it cracked, momentarily dropping his mask of calm rationality. Dr. Mendoza's psychological analysis revealed a personality defined by narcissistic traits and an inability to accept rejection. For someone like Para, being rejected by a 19-year-old girl wasn't just embarrassing, it was intolerable. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one could. The most revealing insight came from his own words, captured in text messages and social media posts. In the months leading up to the murder, his language became increasingly possessive, referring to Agustina as mine in conversations with others, even though they had no committed relationship. What we see in Pablo Para, concludes Dr. Mendoza, is not an anomaly, but rather a textbook case of a controlling personality pushed to its violent extreme. The careful grooming, the escalation of controlling behavior, the final explosive violence when control was lost, these are patterns we see repeatedly in cases of femicide. Perhaps most tragic is how ordinary Para appeared to the outside world. He held a steady job, maintained professional relationships, and seemed, by all external measures, to be a functioning member of society. This ordinary facade made him more dangerous, allowing him to hide in plain sight until it was too late. The truth about Pablo Para serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors, like colleagues, like friends. And in that banality lies their greatest danger, the ability to move through the world undetected, until the moment they choose to reveal their true nature. On May 6, 2024, in a packed courtroom in Cipolletti, the trial of Pablo Parra began. The air was thick with tension as Silvana Capello, wearing a purple ribbon symbolizing the fight against femicide, walked past the man accused of murdering her daughter. It would be the first of many difficult moments in a trial that would captivate Argentina and expose the devastating reality of gender violence. "It's going to hurt to go through all of this," Silvana told reporters before entering the courtroom, "but I know it's necessary for my daughter to get justice." Her words would prove prophetic as the trial unfolded over 10 grueling days, bringing to light every painful detail of Agustina's final hours. Prosecutor Martín Petzetta opened the proceedings with a powerful statement that set the tone for what was to come. "This is not a story about a robbery gone wrong," he declared. "This is a story about a man who believed he owned a young woman, and when she dared to live her own life, he decided to end it." The prosecution's case was methodically constructed around 4 key elements: obsession, rejection, premeditated attack, and cover-up. Over 100 witnesses would take the stand, each adding another piece to the devastating puzzle of Agustina's murder. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Officer Mariana Hurkel, who was first to arrive at the scene. Breaking down on the stand, she described finding Agustina barely alive, while Parra showed more concern for his allegedly stolen possessions than for the dying young woman. Her head was disfigured, Hurkel testified, her voice breaking, but he just kept talking about the robbery. The forensic evidence, presented by Dr. Elena Marquez, painted a horrific picture of Agustina's final moments. "The injuries tell us she fought hard for her life," Dr. Marquez explained, using 3D reconstructions to demonstrate the sequence of the attack. The broken fingers on her left hand show she tried to defend herself. The fatal blows came later, delivered with calculated force. Defense attorney Juan Manuel Cotto attempted to maintain the robbery narrative, focusing on the DNA evidence under Agustina's fingernails that didn't match Parra's. However, this strategy began to unravel as expert testimony explained how the severity and suddenness of the attack might have prevented defensive wounds from containing the attacker's DNA. The trial took a dramatic turn when Parra's cousin, a public defender, was revealed to have shared confidential information with him during the early stages of the investigation. An audio recording of their conversation exposed attempts to manipulate the investigation, leading to a separate ethics investigation. Former partners of Parra provided damning testimony about his controlling behavior and inability to accept rejection. One ex-girlfriend described how he had stalked her after their breakup, creating false social media accounts to monitor her activities. "When I see what happened to Agustina," she testified, "I realize how close I came to the same fate." Throughout the proceedings, Parra maintained his composure, speaking only once for approximately 35 seconds to proclaim his innocence. His calm demeanor, noted by many observers, seemed to work against him, appearing more calculated than genuine. The prosecution's closing arguments were powerful. Agustina Fernández was not just killed, Prosecutor Petzetta declared. She was punished for daring to say no, for choosing her own path, for refusing to be controlled. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution. On May 15, 2024, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Pablo Parra was found guilty of femicide with aggravating circumstances. When the verdict was read, Silvana Capello embraced her husband, their tears mixing with those of supporters who had followed the case from the beginning. The sentencing phase followed on June 7, 2024, where Judge Guillermo Bacuro Lascano handed down the only sentence possible under Argentine law for such a conviction: life imprisonment. The sentence was met with applause from the gallery, while Parra showed no visible reaction. "To you, Mr. Parra," Agustina says, "no is no," Silvana declared in her victim impact statement, her voice strong despite her tears. "You took her life, but you cannot take her truth." The verdict and sentence marked a significant moment in Argentina's ongoing struggle with femicide. The case highlighted how the justice system handles cases of gender violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs before they escalate to tragedy. Defense attorney Cotto announced plans to appeal, citing concerns about evidence handling and jury instructions. However, the appellate court would later uphold both the conviction and sentence, noting the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Parra. For Agustina's family, the conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure, though the pain of their loss remains eternal. Justice has been served, Silvana told reporters outside the courthouse, but no verdict can bring back my daughter. Now we must ensure her story helps protect other young women. The trial of Pablo Parra became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a mirror reflecting society's ongoing struggle with gender violence, power, and control. It showed how justice, though sometimes slow, can eventually prevail, and how one young woman's tragic death could catalyze important conversations about violence against women in Argentina and beyond.